So welcome back to video number 2 in the series posted to the Blackboard LMS for the course MACS 110, Introduction to Mass Communication Theory, for lecture 9, as we move through the topics of chapter 10, the first half of it anyhow. And as we left off with the last brief video, I'll invite you now to switch to slide number 6 in the accompanying PowerPoint presentation for this lecture, entitled Social Constructionism. So as you can see, social constructionism is a school of social theory that argues that the individual's power to oppose or reconstruct important social institutions is limited. And in many ways, of course, this social constructionist response to symbolic interactionism echoes the political economy response to earlier cultural studies, but in a way that is just a little bit more nuanced. So social constructionism argues that once social institutions such as schools, churches, businesses, and military organizations are constructed, any given individual's power to oppose or reconstruct these institutions is limited. Now, according to social constructionists, social institutions wield enormous power over culture because they view the culture propagated by institutions as having a reality that is beyond our, as in the individual's, control. So this school of social theory is also known because of that as the social construction of reality. But it adds another more specific element that echoes the idea of artificial signs from symbolic interaction. It's a theory that assumes an ongoing correspondence of meaning because people share a common sense about its reality. Now, that observation will take us into the realm of what I'll introduce in a moment as typifications, developed by a theorist named Alfred Schutz. Interestingly, Schutz was a banker whose avocation was sociology, and he provided some early systematic discussions of ideas that have become central to social constructionism, so the textbook tells us. Schutz argues that we conduct our lives with little effort or thought because we have developed stocks of social knowledge that we use to quickly make sense of what goes on around us and then structure our actions using this knowledge. And this was the type of logic that was used at the introduction of the chapter, which asked the students reading it to consider, why is it when you are going into a new class or entering a university with a large number of anonymous people, we don't just panic. We're not completely baffled by the situation. Schutz goes on, for example, our knowledge of how to use money with our attitudes toward and feelings about money are just one very powerful example of a small part of these stocks of social knowledge. And Schutz labeled one of the most important forms of the knowledge we possess as typifications, which he defined as mental images that enable people to quickly classify objects and actions and then structure their own actions in response to these. And so certainly the concept of typifications, as you can see, is quite similar to Mead's idea of symbols and the notion of schemas in information processing theory from a previous chapter. And it differs from symbols and information processing theory schemas in emphasizing that these elements of culture can actually be beyond our conscious control, even when they're quite crucial in making sense of things and guiding our actions. So Mead thought of symbols as created in face-to-face interaction, but are the roles on his hypothetical baseball team really that flexible, the textbook asks? Maybe they might be better conceived of as made up of Schutz's typifications. So typifications may get communicated in face-to-face interactions, but they're propagated by social institutions and serve to preserve the power and authority of those institutions, a very political economic perspective. And typifications can operate in some extent, a way of understanding them is like stereotypes. And though they make it easy to interpret even ambiguous situations, they may also distort and bias our experience of these situations. And a relevant and poignant example to many students today is the stereotype of the millennial student, who may have their own set of systems and beliefs and ideologies, and yet frequently the millennial student is generally stereotyped as being somewhat lazy and self-entitled, which is, I think, unfair to broadly apply to anybody born within a certain range. Now, at this point, I'll invite you to switch to slide number 7 in the accompanying PowerPoint presentation for this lecture, where we have an opportunity from the textbook to really make a visual use of Schutz's ideas of the social construction of reality. In explaining how reality is socially constructed, two sociologists, Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman, actually published a book in 1966 entitled The Social Construction of Reality. And they assumed first that there is an ongoing correspondence between meanings and their meanings between, for example, my meanings for something and their meanings in the quote-unquote real world. And that other people who have my meanings share a common sense about their reality with the people around them. And this is really quite evident. You know, for example, if I was in class and I was to knock on a desk, I think we could all agree, yes, that is a desk and it's solid. But these my meanings and other people's meanings that share them, that associate to meanings in the real world, are constituted as symbols. And when social construction of reality, an object that represents some other object, any object that represents some other object, is a symbol. And the textbook gives us the example of 3 symbols for a knife. On the left, we see symbols that might be shared in our society. I think generally everyone in Western culture would agree that all 3 of those images represent one form or other of a knife. However, if you don't share a common sense about their reality, and this common shared sense is usually constrained by language or culture, then there can be no shared meaning. And so the textbook gives the example of the images, or the symbols, in the right hand side of this PowerPoint slide, of miser, cuchillo, and then what is a very poorly drawn, as we discover from the text, butter knife. And unless you speak the languages of 1 and 2, or you have some other context identifying number 3 as a butter knife, then meaning breaks down. At least shared meaning breaks down, and these symbols fail to produce the desired result. So if you could now switch to slide number 8 in the PowerPoint presentation, the accompanying PowerPoint presentation, I'd like to point out that symbolic interaction defines signs and symbols in precisely the opposite way as does the social construction of reality theory. So in the social construction of reality, signs are objects explicitly designed to serve as an index of subjective meaning. And this is very much exactly what symbols are in symbolic interaction. And the example in the textbook, the somewhat bizarre example in the textbook, is given of a knife stuck in a headboard. Now, of course, if you were to wake up with a knife, as pictured here in the PowerPoint slide, jammed into your headboard right above your head, it would obviously mean some sort of ominous threat of murder to you. Unless, for example, you came from a culture where sticking a knife into a headboard meant for example, a proposal of marriage. Wouldn't that be odd to us? And yet there's no reason that it shouldn't. That is to say that the idea of giving a diamond wedding ring to a young woman, generally a young man on one knee to a young woman, as a symbol of a proposal of marriage is entirely arbitrary. It's culturally constructed. And there's no reason that a culture would not construct the jamming a knife into the headboard of your beloved while they sleep as another way of indicating your desire for marriage. And specific cultures are replete with these culturally specific and yet apparently so commonsensical sets of symbols, and they seem so normal from within the culture. And the question I would have asked the class at this point is, for example, does anybody celebrate Christmas? And then the next question would be, how do you celebrate it? And different people will celebrate Christmas differently. And one way, from outside the culture, so in the image here, you have, of course, Santa Claus with a young child, and then there's an image of a Christmas tree with some presents available near its foot for the celebration of mourning. But, another way of describing it might be, so, we cut down a healthy tree, cover it in funeral garb, and watch it die in our living room for 3 weeks. Or we might say we lie to our children about a friendly man who breaks and enters through the chimney. And that is to say that when you say these things out loud, there's nothing natural or normal about these cultural typification schemes. They're simply shared. And so we might look at typification schemes now, it's a term I just introduced, as an extension of Berger and Luckman's, Berger and Luckman's extension of Schutz's idea of just typification. So in social construction of reality, typification schemes are collections of meanings assigned to some phenomenon which come from a social stock of knowledge to pattern interaction with the environment and things and people in it. And this introduces the idea of how we frame our understanding. And that is the topic for next week's class when we look at the second part of Chapter 10. But just in sum, before we move on to the next topic, I generally don't review with students the strengths and weaknesses of that are listed in the convenient boxes in the textbook. But I think in terms of symbolic interactionism and social constructionism, our desire to define one against the other, or our need to do so for the purposes of this course, are actually nicely summed up in the list of weaknesses of social constructionism on page 315. And in these weaknesses, I think the distinction between symbolic interactionism and social constructionism is summed up quite nicely, and it's a good way to get your head around these broad theories if you're struggling with all of the esoterics of them. And one of the weaknesses, as you can see, is that this is a weakness now of social constructionism, is that it tends to give too little recognition to the power of individuals and communities, which is, of course, a criticism leveled against political economy as well. And number two, in some contemporary articulations of social constructionism, it grants too much power to elites who control media content. And again, so what we have, number one, is certainly defensive cultural studies, and number two is a criticism of political economy. And I think that we might look at social interactionism as loosely related with our understanding of symbolic interactionism, and social constructionism as loosely related to our understanding of political economy. And so with that distinction having been made, I'm again going to break the video here before I switch to slide number 9 of the accompanying PowerPoint presentation for this lecture to conclude what I have available for you in today's class, or this week's class, lecture number 9. And we'll pick up in the third video installment for this week's series of videos in video 3.